Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the Engaged Community Series, a powerful collaboration between SAAPRI, the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute, and SAAJCO, the South Asian American Justice Collaborative. I'm Sufyan Sohel. I'm a civil rights attorney and social impact consultant, and I have the honor of moderating today's conversation. For those who may be new to our partners' work, SAAPRI is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization founded in 2001. Through research rooted in community voices and partnerships grounded in purpose, SAAPRI drives policy change at every level, local, regional, and national. At its core, it's about ensuring South Asian Americans are not only seen in the data, but heard in the decision-making. SAAJCO is a civil rights and legal services organization focused on uplifting the South Asian diaspora through direct legal support, civic engagement, and impact litigation. They're on the front lines, protecting rights, holding institutions accountable, and fighting for dignity in every language, accent, and identity that we carry. We're also very grateful to the Saba Foundation and Indiaspora for their generous support in making this series possible. The Engaged Community Series was born from a need to gather intentionally, to build a space where South Asians and our allies can learn together, challenge harmful narratives, and find tools for justice. Each month, we lift up one of three core themes: know your rights, unpacking hate, and civic participation and democracy, with guidance from those on the ground doing the work that we need. Tonight's panel, From Hate to Hope, South Asian Resilience, Resistance, and Thriving Through History, asks us to look back, not just to remember what we've endured, but to understand how far we've come and what still lies ahead. Together, we'll explore the layered history of anti-South Asian hate in the United States, while lifting up the movements, voices, and everyday acts of courage that have carried our communities forward. The roots of this struggle run deep, from the Bellingham riots of 1907, when Sikh and Punjabi mill workers were violently expelled from Washington state, to the 1917 Asian Exclusion Acts that choked immigration from the subcontinent. From the dot-buster attacks of the 1980s and 90s to the post-September 11th wave of hate crimes, profiling and surveilling, targeting Muslim Sikhs, Hindus, and anyone perceived as an other. To today, where we still see so many of our communities scapegoated during COVID, harassed for their faith or heritage, and silenced by systems that were never designed for our belonging. Yet, even in the face of all of this, we've resisted, we've reimagined, and we've reorganized. And that's what we're here to uplift tonight. For a deeper dive, I encourage you to explore SAAPRI's 2024 report, Countering Prejudice, Hate Crimes, and Discrimination Against South Asian Americans, which is available at saapri.org. And before we begin, a quick note: today's session is being recorded and will be available afterward on SAAPRI and SAAJCO's platforms and YouTube. I see a couple of questions in the chat. Feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A. Please use the Q&A for your questions and answers. We'll get to as many as we can during or after the discussion. And thank you for being here. And if you're comfortable, I invite you to take a breath with me. Think about a moment you felt both unseen and determined to rise anyway. That tension between harm and hope lives at the heart of our community story. And today, we honor both. I am so pleased to have with me today four remarkable leaders. I have Anne Kalayil, PhD, who is an Associate Vice President at Columbia College Chicago. Anirvan Chatterjee, he's a South Asian American activist and community-based historian from the San Francisco Bay Area. Manjusha Kulkarni, who is the Executive Director of AAPI Equity Alliance and co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate. And Amandeep Sidhu, who's a partner at Winston & Strawn, board member of the Sikh National Bar Association, and a co-founder of the Sikh Coalition. I just spoke for a lot. Thank you all for your patience. My first question for all of the panelists today is, our title is From Hate to Hope. When you hear those words, what does that journey mean to you personally or into your work? And Anirvan, I'll start with you.
Hey, thanks for having me. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I felt pretty comfortable in my skin growing up. And I remember 9/11 and just this moment when all the safety I felt was just like totally shaken up. And I'm not Muslim. I'm not Sikh. I wear no articles of faith, but there was just a sense that I was scared for my family in a way I'd never been before. And it wasn't just me, it was all like everybody I knew, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, Sikh, South Asian. And there's just this very like quickly, I think for a lot of us, we realized that if we're all going to be targeted together, then we have to stand up together. And that's very real. It's very concrete. It's not just some kind of like theoretical solidarity. It's just like incredibly practical. For me, it's definitely been like I've gone through that journey of feeling scared, feeling atomized, and then being like, we can do this together, and we can kind of really be building that hope by doing that kind of collective work.
Thank you. Anne?
So my parents came here in 1956. So my father in 56, my mother in 59. And so I grew up listening to the stories of, their sort of journey coming here and being, the experiences they had. They were not white, they were not Black, and so they were, continuously othered. Fast forward when I was in 8th grade, we moved into Rogers Park, and it was a completely non-diverse neighborhood. I was the only South Asian in the entire grammar school. And my first day coming back, as I was coming back home, somebody pushed me and called me a damn Hindu and said I had to go back to where I came from. And I was born here, right? And so for me to experience that in a new neighborhood, I was completely shocked. And I think to me, that's been sort of a point of reference to the fact that, yes, I'm American, but I am a South Asian American, right? Or an Indian American, et cetera. And so that has always been a point of reference for me. And we all get that same question, where are you really from, right? And we've heard that all, so many times. But for me, the journey is to continue to make this country my home and a home for all of us, because I have nieces and nephews and great nieces and great nieces and nephews, and even just today, you hear about stories where even these children who are like, who have born here, their parents have been born here, yet they are still othered. And so for me, the journey has been to try to, this is why I co-founded SAAPRI, is to be able to do this work so that we can make sure that for generations that this is home to us.
Thank you. Beautifully said. And I totally resonate with the where you really from question. I feel all of us have been asked that and throughout our lives and stories. Manjusha.
Thanks for that question, and it's really an honor to be with this amazing panel. I think for me, what hate to hope means is it really is emblematic of the American journey for us as South Asian Americans. I came with my parents in the post 1965 wave in 1971. Sadly, in 1980, when my mom applied for a position with a local family practice group in Montgomery, Alabama, the panel of white male physicians had simply one question for her, which was, why do you foreigners come here and take all of our jobs? She and my father exhibited a huge amount of courage and bravery and brought a class action lawsuit that was ultimately settled and changed policy in Alabama around foreign medical graduates being able to practice. And so I think of that, and I think of the hope that they had in raising 3 kids in this country. And I also think about us collectively. When we look at the Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917, it came out of hate against specifically our communities. We were called the Hindu, beware the Hindu hordes and the dusky peril. But then within, 50 years later, there was the Immigration Act of 1965, which changed America, I think for the good by, for the first time, again, allowing so many of us to enter the US and live our lives and thrive. So really it is, again, to me, the journey for us in America as South Asian Americans.
Thank you. Amandeep?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sufyan, and thank you to SAAJCO for having this panel and inviting me to join. So, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, which, as folks likely know, was the capital of the Confederacy. So, when my parents, on their journey, left Punjab, went to England, faced a tremendous amount of discrimination there before coming to the U.S. and decided to settle in Virginia. Two things. One, they didn't want me and my two younger brothers to face some of those challenges that they faced and felt like they needed at least for us to assimilate. So when they first came to this country, my mom and dad both cut their hair and felt like they needed to integrate. As soon as they moved to Richmond, though, they both restored their identity as Sikhs. But because they had made that decision, they left it up to me and my brothers to make that decision on our own, which was kind of a risky thing to do for Sikh parents. And my hair was cut. I shaved. I had my hair cut through middle school. I kept my hair my freshman year in high school in ninth grade. Yeah, there were two or three inflection points before that. My father wearing a turban in a very small town. He was the second Sikh family in central Virginia. There was this exotification of the Sikh turban, that it was, is your dad a genie, is your father a wizard. But with the first Iraq War, the Gulf War in the early 90s, 91, 92, we were on vacation when the war broke out. And, all of a sudden there were police officers and staff from the hotel at the door of our room. My mother and father were speaking at the doorway, and then eventually came back in. And I was the oldest, and I was, I guess, in eighth grade at the time. And they told us that they were receiving death threats, that they had someone who was affiliated or associated with terrorism staying in the hotel, and they wanted to give us protection. So we had security with us for the remainder of that trip. That was the first moment where I said, okay, this is a scary thing. Flash forward to 9/11, and that was certainly the inflection point for the Sikh American community, a time where all of our parents' generation had built local connections. And I grew up, going to community centers and going to Lions clubs and going to churches and helping people understand who we are, just as a form of education and a form of protecting ourselves from discrimination and bias. So with that framework, we thought we had made these inroads in these local communities and larger metropolitan areas. 9/11 was clearly the moment where the Muslim community, the Sikh community, the broader South Asian community, and quite frankly, the community perceived to be South Asian or brown or Middle Eastern or Arab, so many victims in the aftermath of 9/11. That was the moment where we came together and said, we have to do something. And I was privileged to be part of the group that came together in DC, New York, Chicago, out on the West Coast to create the Sikh Coalition, to fill the void of providing, access to legal services and advocacy and community engagement around hate crimes and profiling and employment discrimination and everything that's come since. When we talk about from hate to hope, I look back at that moment and could spend hours describing the horrifying circumstances that our community faced, that I faced personally, as the victim of hate crimes in the aftermath of 9/11. But what came out of that was not only the organization of the Sikh community that is now very robust, but I think the breaking down of some of the barriers that existed in the South Asian community between our various, whether it's religious or regional, in the diaspora, the baggage that our parents' generation brought with us to the U.S., I think those barriers broke down. So, we're talking about the dot busters, earlier on in one of the comments, and thinking about the affinity and the allyship that's been built I see hope in all of that.
Well said. Thank you so much. Anti-Asian hate didn't start in 2020. And for South Asians, it's been woven through immigration bans, surveillance, discrimination, and erasure. Long before the headlines, our communities were resisting erasure. Anne and Anirvan, you both have done deep work archiving and lifting those stories. Anne, can you walk us through a quick review of South Asian American history in the United States and share with us the importance of SAAPRI's Oral History Project?
Sure. So, I mean, I think you've heard each one of the speakers, touch upon some of those sort of key milestones. We start here in the 1790s and the 1800s. And you have sort of, isolated South Asian individuals who actually came here because, they were, there's a connection between the United States and British, right? British India at that time, right? And so there were people who came on the ships to end up, in American ports. And Vivek Bald has written a book on the Bengali Harlems, which kind of gives you a deeper history into how these individuals ended up, in forming what's known as a Bengali Harlem. You go into 1880s and the 1900s, and I think Amandeep talked about the Punjabi Sikhs immigrating to the West Coast, and especially in California, working in agriculture and the lumber as well as in the railroads. Many of them settled in the Central Valley. But then you start talking about the early 20th century, you have the forming of the Ghadar Party in 1913 in San Francisco, where, you have some significant organizing against British rule in India, right? And I think, Manjusha talked about the Asiatic Bar Zone Act, known as the 1917 Immigration Act, right? Which restricted immigration, Asian immigration, including, South Asians into the United States. Many of you have heard about the 1923 United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind, the Supreme Court that ruled that Indians are not eligible for a U.S. citizenship because they are not, quote, white. And, finally, the Luce-Seller Act in 1946, which allowed for the first time a small quota of Indians, right? Because 100 per year to immigrate to the United States and to be able to be naturalized. Now, just to remember, in that quota of 100, there isn't students are allowed to come, right? Student visas don't fall into that quota, and so I want to touch upon what's really important, and that is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which led to the 1965 Immigration Act. This is what opened up immigration to allow us, into more South Asians into this country, not for the first time by your nationality, but by your skills, by family, et cetera. There's 7 preferences. And then subsequent to that, whatever happened, foreign policy is really influenced, so much of our experience in this country. Now, one of the things that we did in SAAPRI did was we looked at a group of South Asians who were in Illinois between 1945 and 65. That's the beginning, obviously, of World War II, and then before the 1965 Immigration Act. And what we did was, if you go to the next page really quickly here, we interviewed, 33 South Asians, and you have a little bit of a sort of a demographic here. And we were very intentional. We had a small grant from the Illinois Humanities Council. And what we wanted to do is to make sure that this oral history, the histories were done, the interviews were done by either the children or the grandchildren of these pioneers. And what was really important about that is because for the very first time, the children who often heard, they actually listened during the interview process and understood their relatives' experience. And if you go to the next slide, next page, you'll see, many of them actually came, though they came from the subcontinent, there were some who actually came from Hong Kong, right? There were Sindhis who were in Hong Kong who actually ended up migrating. And, this is a quote from, one of the pioneers who basically said, they came by ship, they didn't fly. They spent 31 days, taking that passage, leaving behind, family members all alone, right? Not really, barely knowing, and I can just imagine how that journey is. And I know how that journey is because both my parents came by ship, and and actually have a record of that. So if you go to the next page, you just really quickly just wanted to capture, there's somebody who actually came from Hong Kong, who was Cindy, and his name is Mr. Bilani. He came and, he said that it was amazing. He was like 18 years old and he comes here and he gets to meet the mayor of Chicago, right? Who shakes his hand. And he's like, never, ever would I've ever thought that, that this could happen. And he was just like, this is it. I'm going to be a Chicago and I'm going to live here. And he's still, still very active and he's still here in Chicago. Next. Here's some things, right, where, it was very interesting because the women that we spoke to said they were advised to wear their saris or wear Indian attire so that they could maintain that identity or for being mistaken for being Black. This was the recommend, this was the advice that they got, right? And then there were those who said, they had such a hard time where they didn't realize why they were being segregated. They didn't understand this America that was Black and white, and they couldn't find them being brown didn't know where their place was. And therefore it was so hard for them to navigate. Next. And this is just wanted to say that, they weren't quiet. They weren't just sort of, being, quiet students, right? Very, very, very pertaining to today's environment. They were out there and they were, here's a picture of where they're out, debating the equal rights of women, right? And these are international students, touching upon topics that were really, very risky for them, because they were here on a student visa. But this is what they did. And, these pioneers, stayed and they formed, many organizations that are here in Illinois that, they were the pioneers of our community. And it's a history that there's a huge gap in this period of history of South Asian Americans in the United States. But this is something that we've just felt that capturing this has been so important for us, particularly as we passed the TEACH Act here in Illinois. We've been able to include this in curriculum from K through 12.
Thank you so much, and thank you to walking through it. And I was just at my niece's water polo game yesterday, and I saw a very similar picture of students just huddled around in the lobby, having very similar conversations on social issues. And I wanted to jump in and listen to it more, but my mom led me away to the game. But just seeing how this is part of our history of people of different backgrounds talking about very important topics that affect us all, and the role modeling that they've done for us to continue those conversations today. So thank you so much for sharing that. Anirvan, you're a historian and you lead these radical walking tours in Berkeley. What have you learned through this process and what have you been sharing with others?
And if you can just go to the slide with the walking tour. So for the last 12 years now, we've been leading twice monthly history walking tour of South Asian American life and activism in Berkeley, California, which is really close to San Francisco. And it's a 3-hour tour. And what we do over the course of those 3 hours is we visit some of the original sites connected to about 120 years of South Asian resistance and organizing in the city, anti-colonial, queer, feminist, labor. If you ever come out to the Bay, folks should totally join. One of the things that I really enjoy about doing this kind of like public history work is that a lot of the folks on the tour are not South Asian, and even among South Asians, I mean, I think initially I kind of figured it'd be people who are really into history or people who are really into activism, and it's not. I think there's just a huge amount of hunger within our communities to learn some of our stories. And there are 2 stories from the walking tour that really resonate with me in terms of kind of thinking about that from hate to hope kind of theme. One of the stories that we always talk about is the story of the Bagai family. So The Bagais were one of the earliest kind of full families that showed up on the West Coast of the United States. They arrived in 1915 from Peshawar in present-day Pakistan. So it's Mr. Vaishnadas Bagai, his wife Kala Bagai, and their 3 children. And they take the ship, they get off the ship in San Francisco, and Kala is amazed at this like place that they arrive in. She's Sikh, her husband is Hindu, they're bringing up their 3 children. And a couple of years later, they are starting to figure out like a new place to live. They try to move to the city of Berkeley, California. They acquire a home. And as they're about to move into their home, the door is locked. The house is barred. They're not able to enter. And they end up having to essentially escape back to San Francisco. That's where Vishnu ends up starting like a general store. They sort of build a life there. They get help from German friends. They start building community. And Vishnu was really committed to 2 things. Number one, he was really involved with the Ghadar Party, which is the early anti-colonial movement of Indian activists and revolutionaries. And when I say India, I mean present-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. So he was involved in that, but he was also really excited to become an American. He did not want to be a British colonial subject anymore. So he worked and he fought and he managed to get US citizenship. And you've already heard it today a couple of times about 1923 and the Supreme Court, that case that led to kind of a mass denaturalization. Almost every single person of South Asian origin in the United States had their citizenship stripped of them. It was the first time in American history that an entire national group, an entire ethnic group, had their citizenship pulled. Today, when we think about denaturalization, I think a lot about that moment. Sufyan, if you can go to the next slide. And yeah, the one with the passport photo. Yeah. So Vishnu fights for 5 years to get his citizenship back. And in 1928, he ends up taking his own life because of this battle to reacquire citizenship. And he wrote the suicide note in the San Francisco Examiner, and he talks about coming to America, dreaming of making this land my home. His passport is taken, his citizenship is taken. And he says, I don't choose to live the life of an interned person. I'm in a free country, I can move around, but is life worth living in a gilded cage? And it is hard to read this note, his last words. But then on our tour, we tell his story and we talk about the moment when the Bagai family went from experiencing community-based hate, the hatred of their neighbors, and then that turns into kind of policy violence. That turns into these larger policies of having their rights stripped and denaturalization. But the story doesn't end with them. Sufyan, if you can go to the next slide. So his wife, Kala, survives. She ends up surviving. She's a widow. She raises her 3 sons. She remarries, and marriage was taboo in the community at the time. She moves to Southern California around World War II, where she becomes kind of a community elder. She becomes kind of a community builder and community welcomer. New immigrants get off ships and later airplanes, and they go and hang out with Kala Bagai and her family. She lived until 1982, when she was about 90 years old. And over the pandemic, we fought for many of us here in Berkeley, California, to name a downtown street Kala Bagai Way, both to honor her work as a community builder, as one of the earliest South Asian women on the West Coast, as well as somebody who survived local racism in the US. And it took the organizing work by almost 300 people, but it's there now. And if you ever come visit Berkeley, California, and you're in the heart of downtown, you can look up, and in Kala Bagai Way is just a street in the heart of the city. I think about the Bagais a lot because they're a family that experienced all of it. They experienced community-based hate. They experienced the worst possible kind of hate metastasizing into these like federal policies that like hampered them. It led to heartbreak for Kala watching her husband take his own life. And yet she continued, and yet she persevered, and yet she started working with other American women and South Asian women. They would do like fundraisers for post-partition refugees in 1947, 1948. and she continued to sort of live her whole life. And when I think about the Bagai family, I see very much kind of that theme of like from hate to hope. Like they've been through all of it and they continue to survive. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much. That was so helpful. And I'm really resonating both with her story as well as, let me go back to this previous slide, his of, but now they come to me and say I'm no longer an American citizen. This feeling of not belonging, not being welcome in a country that we choose to make our home, or belonging to, that we feel like we belong to, and how that's resonating a lot with a lot of communities I talk to on a daily basis, even today, so many years later, of that energy that's out there. I'm gonna pivot slightly to Amandeep and Manju. Both of you have built institutions. Amandeep, you've built the Sikh Coalition, the Sikh National Bar. Manju, you've done Stop AAPI Hate, and you both have done so much magic in so many other areas. You're reshaping legal and advocacy landscapes. What inspired you to build something new rather than working within existing frameworks? And I'll start with you, Amandeep, because you started touching about it a little bit when you talked about creating the Sikh Coalition.
Absolutely. No, thank you for the question. So, I think that this panel certainly, and the audience, familiar with sort of that overwhelming feeling that we all had on 9/11. I was a couple of years out of college, working in Washington, D.C. I worked for a federal contractor that had an office in Old Town Alexandria. And if you know the D.C. geography, right on the other side of the Pentagon, I lived in courthouse in Arlington. So I drove past the Pentagon every day. And as I was driving in that day, I had the radio on, and the first tower had been hit. By the time I got to my office and came upstairs, everyone was glued around the TV. The second tower had been hit. Within a few minutes, we saw black smoke coming up from the Pentagon before it was being reported that the Pentagon had been hit. And those who lived through that moment, phone lines went down. We did have cell phones. They weren't smart, but they worked. They weren't working that day. Landlines were down. The only way to communicate was via email. And this is pre-social media. So one of the ways that we were communicating as a community was through Yahoo groups and chats. And so I was sending emails to my family and my friends. I had friends that were in the World Trade Center, one of whom died in the towers collapse. And that kind of moment of experiencing that pain and tragedy and fear as an American, right? Leaving aside my identity as a Sikh or a South Asian, it was just this overwhelming feeling of being attacked as a country, as a nation, as Americans. I was not so naive to not realize that this was going to be bad. And it only took me driving home that day as I literally rounded around the roads that were still at that time, open. A person drove me off the side of the road, honking his horn, yelling epithets, and I pulled over on the side, and he kept driving, it wasn't something that I hadn't experienced before, so it was nothing new in having heard that type of commentary in high school or college, with the occasional bigot that I'd run into, and I'd feel compelled to try to educate them in that moment about who I am and why I have this identity. So that, I came home, I came to my apartment, and I turned on the news and I started crying. And I just felt the weight of 9/11. And I know that so many people around the country were feeling that. And the next day we said, okay, we have to do something, because there was no infrastructure like an anti-defamation league, or an NAACP legal defense fund. We did not have a national presence in the Sikh community, and those loosely organized groups of professionals in the New York metropolitan area, in the West Coast, around the DC area, and around the country. We were connected by the fabric of the Sikh community, that we had been involved in Sikh youth camps. We had gone to the occasional conference together. We were friends. We were allies. We were mentors. We were supporters. I drew inspiration from so many of those people when I decided to keep my hair and maintain my identity. And we all kind of had the same idea that we had to do something. And, thinking about what needed to be done differently, and we looked to our parents' generation. They had done a really good job of integrating locally and engaging with local communities. They hadn't been able to penetrate having a national presence. At the time, there was a Sikh Media Watch and Resource Task Force, SMART, now SALDEF, Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund. At the time, SMART was the advocacy the organization focused on media representations in the Sikh community, but wasn't addressing that existential threat. So we created a database on September 12th, 2001, to start cataloging hate crimes and employment discrimination and other instances of profiling by law enforcement. And, it was that afternoon that on the Yahoo groups, we heard that a Sikh gentleman was going to a Gurdwara in Jackson Heights in Queens and was attacked with a spiked baseball bat and survived, but was beaten brutally. And it only took a week before the first murder after 9/11 was Balbir Singh Sodhi in Arizona, in Mesa. And so we knew that we had to radically transform that infrastructure. And that's how the Sikh Coalition was born, and quite literally a coalition of all of those loosely organized groups and individuals coming together and saying we need to have commonality around those disciplines of legal services, community engagement, and education, and media depictions, and all of those pieces. And using my background as a consultant, we did an offsite, and we had a whiteboard, and we had everything we thought was possible to do once we had a moment to breathe, 6 months after 9/11. And we mapped out what would ultimately become the fully realized Sikh Coalition, with a staff of almost 30 at this point, and a presence in all the major metropolitan areas in the country. And it is an institution. It's an institution that will survive me. It'll survive the founder group. And one other thing I'll say is that when we're thinking about what we did differently, in the Sikh faith, there's this absolute concept of equality, right? Equality between men and women, caste, color, creed. That concept is embedded in the Sikh faith, but was not reflected in our communities. And so having Sikh women leading was very much a part of that equation. And so the group that founded, the group that has led, it is not by accident that the last 3 executive directors have been women, or the legal directors have been female leaders in the Sikh community and beyond. That is very much by design, because they're not only the most effective and qualified, but we want to send a message that we're not going to put up with the bullshit that our parents' generation allowed to happen. And so we do that very deliberately.
I love that. I love that intentionality behind it, and having worked closely with the Sikh Coalition in my Muslim civil rights advocacy, like, it's just such a powerhouse of an organization, and just always an ally in the deepest trenches. So thank you for your leadership in that. Manju, how about you?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, for us, what we saw in 2020, and, as you pointed out earlier, Sufyan, is that hate didn't begin against our communities then. As Anne and Anirvan pointed out, we've seen many, many times in American history where our community has been hit. But this was the latest and newest iteration. And what we saw first was here locally in Los Angeles on February 4th, a 12-year-old boy was on campus at his middle school. Another child approached him and said, "You're a COVID carrier, go back to China." And reflexively, he said, because his family's not from China, he said, "I'm not Chinese." And when he said that, the other boy punched him in the face and head 20 times. And so that was an immediate lesson to us that something was anew, that, you know, we had seen different types of hate against our community, but that this was now related to the virus itself. But excuse me, given that there was not a single confirmed case of COVID in Southern California, we saw that racism spread more virulently than even the virus itself. And so what we wanted to do first and foremost was to learn about it, learn from our community members exactly what was happening. And so within just a few short weeks of posting our website, it really started with a Google form. We got several hundred incident reports from all across the country. And this was without any media attention. This was without any sort of professional marketing or outreach. And what I thought was so important about that is that every day folks were telling us their stories. They were letting us know about the hurt, the harm, the challenges they were experiencing. And, you know, when we did a survey 6 months later to ask, you know, what is the biggest threat to you and your families, they actually said anti-Asian hate. They did not say COVID-19, and this is before the vaccine. This is when, you know, hundreds of thousands of people were dying across our country, and yet it was the racism that made people most nervous. They were literally carrying baseball bats in their cars. They were hiding their identity with sunglasses and hats. And so that was really why we wanted to do something different and also really raise the profile of this new phenomenon so that people would understand and not feel isolated. And in fact, that's what many people told us afterward, is that this helped them in that their time of need. And the last thing I'll say is what we've tried to do, and I believe Anirvan mentioned this as well, is that the connection between individual hate acts, rhetoric, and policy, right? From the beginning, Stop AAPI Hate has done that. Even when a lot of academics said that's not the way to look at it, that policy is somehow different, candidates' rhetoric is somehow different. And yet we see today exactly how hate fuels the rhetoric against immigrants, the policies that are leading to people being sent to concentration camps. It is that same type of hate, and it's leveled not just against us as South Asians or individually within our communities, not just against Asian Americans, but really all of us as people of color.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You both also faced resistance. Could you tell me, Manju, what's been a powerful win and where you may have hit a wall?
Sure. So, I mean, we have had a number of great wins. I think early on, when President Biden, just, I believe a day or so after his inauguration, he issued an executive order about anti-Asian hate and about ways to take action, how to view our communities, how to implement policies that recognize the harm that we faced. And so that was, I think, so gratifying because at the highest stage of government, we were being recognized and our problems were being identified and addressed, really. I would say the second thing is seeing people in the streets. So after the Atlanta shooting in which 6 Asian women were shot and killed by a white supremacist, we saw all across the country individuals, grandmas and grandpas in wheelchairs and walkers, dadus, like out in the street, ajumas, titas, and a number of them couldn't speak English, you know, proficiently, but they could say that this was wrong, that this was un-American, that it was unconstitutional, violated laws. And that's what was like really, really important for us, is that the community spoke out against the hate that they were experiencing.
Thank you. How about you, Aman?
Sure. Resistance was like the name of the game for us. And so we were a very small community, you know, in the grand scheme of things in the United States, a minority within a minority in the South Asian community. There were multiple forms of resistance. So you know, focus specifically on kind of overcoming the challenges of getting that seat at the table, because that was one of the biggest challenges. We knew we had the competence and the resources and the people, even if it was only a small handful that were lawyers or practicing or advocates or had the education and capability of taking what they had done in the private or public sector and helping our community directly. But we needed a seat at the table, and the broader AAPI community, the South Asian community, opened doors. At the time, you know, SALT was one of the only kind of South Asian advocacy organizations at the time, South Asian Americans Leading Together. And Deepa Iyer opened those doors at DOJ and helped us get into those meetings and educate at every instance the unique identity that Sikhs have. The assumption is that turban equals Muslim equals terrorism, and Sikhism is sort of lost in that equation. There were a lot of folks in the community that wanted to say we're not Muslim. And we very deliberately said that is not the way that we're going to work forward. We're going to work together. We're going to condemn all forms of hate and all forms of bias and discrimination, but use that as an opportunity to educate the broader just community about who we are as Sikhs. And I just sort of had this, you know, very kind of maybe aspirational or romanticized, you know, expectation that we can really change hearts and minds when we get to know people, and that we can, you know, explain who we are in a human way. And so in every instance, that sort of that culture of engagement has been part of what we've done with the Sikh Coalition. And, you know, coming full circle, I remember being in meetings after 9/11 where we did get that seat at the table at DOJ, and we were in the room when there were meetings convened of interfaith representative organizations across the broader South Asia, Middle Eastern, and Arab communities, where we were voicing our issues and concerns. And that was in the Bush administration, and then continued in the Obama administration. So it was bipartisan access to those opportunities. And about a year ago, after we formed the Sikh National Bar Association, our board was invited to go meet with Associate Attorney General Kristen Clark in the Civil Rights Division and her staff. And not only were we there to talk about issues from the Bar Association and legal challenges and issues that we wanted to try to address in terms of bringing that Sikh legal community together, but sitting at the table were two Sikh DOJ lawyers, and not part of the bar board, but part of AAG Clark's staff. And so it was an emotional moment as I sat at the table, because I'd been in that room dozens and dozens of times over the last 25 years. But in that moment to say, okay, well, you know, we've overcome some of that resistance, we've overcome some of those challenges, and we've put people not just at the table, but in positions of leadership, and where that visibility is so important and so powerful. To have for the Sikh community, that identity, you know, in the mainstream, and not as something that is going to prevent or inhibit you from achieving greatness.
Thank you so much. And that's beautiful. And someone just flagged, and I want to apologize. We misspelled your name in the in your name underneath. It's Sidhu and not Sindhu. So I just wanted to call that out and acknowledge it. You raised a good point earlier that I've been reflecting upon a lot lately, and it's examining our own biases. I know growing up in a Indian, Muslim, family in the suburbs of Chicago, like the things I was exposed to from my broader community, anti-Blackness, homophobia, casteism, classicism, some of those still persist today. And, realizing, to echo what you said, is that we don't survive alone. We have to show up and stand up for each other has been so integral in my work. But at the same time, solidarity isn't always easy across a lot of those different systems. Anirvan, my next question is for you. You worked a lot in Black Desi solidarity. Could you talk a little bit about the lessons you've learned about building real coalition, especially when our communities have to unlearn our own biases?
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about the moments after the very first Black Lives Matter uprisings in the mid-2010s, and then the second kind of wave of Black Lives Matter uprisings in the 2020 onwards. And in both situations, there were so many folks in South Asian communities who are trying to grapple with the situation, figure out what it looks like to be engaged in solidarity with Black folks and with Black-led movements, when a lot of people just felt very like uncomfortable, didn't really like understand like the context in which they lived in. And the thing that for me as a history person that was really helpful is just being able to kind of walk people through the different ways that folks have done this before. We're not inventing any of this from scratch. Uh, and I know you mentioned the Black Bengalis, for example, and there's histories of men from present-day Bangladesh and West Bengal, Bengali Muslims who came to the U.S. Between the 1880s and the second wave in the 1920s, married into Black, Puerto Rican, and Creole families. And just the idea that like when our people were new to this country, African America took us in, and just learning that, like really grappling with that, it makes me emotional. I think it makes a lot of people emotional to know that we have people who stood up for us. I think about the role of all the Black activists that stood with us during our freedom movements, for example. Folks like the Black gay activist Barry Rustin, for example, who would do things like do sit-down protests at the British Embassy in the 1940s, demanding that India gain freedom from colonialism. I think about folks like Langston Hughes, who would write about like attacks on um, then Indian freedom fighters like Nehru, in the same time that he talked about like police brutality in a US context. And on the flip side, I think about folks like Rustin and the Thurmans and others who went to South Asia and brought back a lot of tactics. We have these histories of the ways that our communities have like stood for each other. But the one story that like always sticks with me is 1964. There are two professors in Jackson, Mississippi, Amit Kizilbash from Pakistan and I believe Shabitri Chattopadhyay from India. And they're both teaching at Tougaloo College, which is a historically Black college. And this is in the middle of the freedom movement, the Black Civil Rights movement. And Black students, like their Black students are doing really critical work. And so where do these South Asians sit in terms of like grappling with questions of solidarity? Which side do you stand on? And this like Pakistani man and this Indian Hindu woman, they know where their allegiances are and they're trying to figure it out. And they found ways of using their kind of in-between brown, not quite Black, not quite white identity to, for example, buy movie tickets from white movie theaters because they could do that, their Black students couldn't, and pass those movie tickets on to their Black students who would then be able to kind of go to the movie theater and be like, look, I got a ticket. And I think about like just these very, very, very like small concrete actions. And they paid the price. Hamid Kizilbash, for example, I believe he was attacked by the Klan or by white racists at some point in time, dragged out of his car in the middle of the night when he was driving, and they spared him when they realized that he was a foreigner. Again, that thing of like where you're targeted, but then you're also, sometimes that also leads to a certain kind of safety. And when I talk to young people and tell these stories where not only have Black folks stood up for us, but there have been like very concrete examples where we have stood up for Black folks, I think learning those stories are kind of a really helpful additive to knowing all the ways that we know our community is racist, we know our community is anti-Black, but really being able to learn as much as possible and grapple with it, for me, I find that incredibly helpful.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Manju, what lessons have you learned about building real coalition? I mean, I already asked Anirvan that, but I'd love to ask you that too. You're bringing together, when we talk about Stop AAPI, I hate that we're in Asian American Heritage Month right now, right? And we have so many different cultures and nationalities that are all parts of it. So what's been challenging and rewarding of that experience?
Yeah, thank you. Well, one of the most rewarding things, which is also shown, I think, solidarity within the Asian American Pacific Islander community in California, is that, I mentioned the Atlanta shooting and the activism that came out of it. Well, out of that activism came policy change. It led to a couple different bills being passed in the California legislature and signed by Governor Newsom around safety and public transit, around civil rights enforcement and public accommodations. And the most amazing really was a $200 million AAPI equity budget, most of the money of which went to community groups to fight not only anti-Asian hate, but to fight against anti-Blackness, against anti-immigrant sentiment and racism the Latino community experiences. Other marginalized groups like LGBTQ, Muslim, Sikh, and Jewish also got funding from that to address the hate in their communities. So I think that was really a lesson, one that while it came out of a particular extremely harmful incident, we could come together and get the policies that all of our communities need. I think what is divisive, unfortunately, is the model minority framing. And too often that goes hand in hand with the anti-Blackness, which is that people unfortunately sometimes wear that as a badge of honor, not realizing that the term came to fruition. It was coined by Professor William Peterson from Berkeley in '65 to say that Asian Americans and Japanese specifically were a model compared to African Americans, both socioeconomically as well as in terms of being silent. And so what I mean by that is, even though he was a professor, he didn't seem to understand history and the impacts of slavery as well as Jim Crow in terms of, socioeconomics of the Black community, not seeing and understanding that Asian Americans don't necessarily feel those same impacts. And then the other was to encourage essentially Asian Americans not to speak out, because he said that African Americans were a problem minority because they complained. Imagine that during the civil rights movement to characterize the fighting against secondary status as being problematic. And so I think, unfortunately, too many people in our community have learned the wrong lesson, that they should remain quiet, that they shouldn't stand up for their rights, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. We must be loud. We must be proud of who we are, and we have to fight for justice for all of our communities.
I love that. And thank you so much for articulating that so beautifully. And question for you is, you've been uplifting stories of our communities for so long, but oftentimes I see that they're sidelined in broader either Asian American or racial justice movements. How do we reclaim our space without disconnecting from the larger fight or the larger narrative?
It's a really good question. I think it's, what we've been talking about a lot is pretty much today has been our long history of really building this country. And I think for so many people, particularly younger people who really don't know that history, if you don't know the past, right, how can you reclaim the present? right? How can you reclaim your role in, you know, in today's society? And so I think, you know, what was done in Illinois, which is passing that legislation that mandated a unit of curriculum of Asian American studies in K through 12, I think that needs to be replicated, right, in almost all of the states, right? And then communities like ourselves need to then help work on building curriculum so that it can be, and training teachers so that they can actually teach our history, right? Because, listen, this is not something, you know, discrimination and the othering of us is not something that happened way back and that it's not happening today. I hear stories of even children, right, who are othered because of how they look. And I'm talking about, you know, just even today. And so how do you tell a 5-year-old girl, little girl who doesn't get invited to a birthday party because she looks different and they mistaken her for being another? You know, what do you say to someone like that who is, you know, with that experience, to think about, you know, how are they, you know, how can they claim their space in being an American, right? We have to also remind our own community, right, of the mistakes that we say. You know, when we say, for example, oh yeah, so-and-so, he married, you know, my son or my daughter married an American, right? Your son and your daughter who was born and brought up here is also an American. What does that mean, right? So we have to work within our own community. We have our own biases. We bring paradigms from overseas and we look at ourselves as being Hindu or Muslim, and that's a, you know, or Christian or whatnot, Sikh and whatnot, right? Like it, and we end up separating ourselves instead of coming together on common ground so that we can work to empower our communities, to strengthen our own ecosystem. And that's the kind of work that continues. And I so appreciate everyone on this panel who continues to do that. And that's a struggle that needs to go on.
I agree. Thank you. I'm resonating a lot with what you just said. Growing up, my mom would always say, stop being so American, or that's what the Americans do. And I'd be like, I am one, right? And how do we navigate some of that? And I have another follow-up for you is, you know, I can honestly say like you are a trailblazer in the Chicagoland South Asian community. You know, you've from personal experiencing leading academics, leading social justice and nonprofit roles. How do you navigate sometimes being the only one in the room and not being tokenized and standing up for your different identities? And how has that shaped your leadership?
I don't give up. I have to say, you know, in the 1990s, when there's an organization here in Chicago that was formed in 1980, it was called the Indo-American Democratic Organization. It's one of the very few political organizations, I think, nationally that was focused on, you know, organizing South Asians in the political realm. You know, my father was one of the co-founders, and I got involved in it in the 1990s just because my mom wanted to get my dad out. And I was not interested, but then, you know, but when you know, the first meeting I go to, it's in the back room in Devon Avenue, if you're not familiar, one of the restaurants behind the scene. And it's like, you know, I went there and it was like, I was the only South Asian woman, right? And I was still in graduate school and I started saying, you know, we need to get more women involved. And I think one of the uncles said, oh yeah, why don't you go ahead and organize the women, right? And then, you know, and so I realized that I needed to bridge the first generation with the younger generation to be able to move forward the agenda of organizing our community and getting them out to vote and et cetera. You know, I say fast forward in 2008, you know, I was one of the co-chairs of the Asian Americans for Obama. And I have to tell you, in the primary, it was really, really hard to get people to support him. And the reason why is because obviously our own biases, right? You know, you would hear some comments from people who would, you know, you were stunned, right? How could you, and then there was this, you know, disbelief of the fact that a Black man would sit in the White House, right? And so, you persevere and you find common ground and you talk to people and and tell them, you know, I mean, you just have to be persistent. And I think, you know, these are some of the stories where, you know, and even when you get to a position where you're the first of whatever, you know, heading up a regional agency or whatnot, you make sure you open doors for our community, right? And you make sure you open those doors wide enough, and you make sure that the people who are in public service continue to understand that these are communities that also have a seat at the table. And you just have, you know, you just have to be focused on that.
Thank you so much. Amandeep, for you, I see a couple people raising hands. If you can drop your questions in the Q&A, I can take a look at them and incorporate them into the 20 minutes we have left. Thank you. Amandeep, have there been moments where you felt conflict between your personal identities and balancing that with both your legal profession and career and community advocacy? And how did you navigate that?
Yeah, so you know, you've heard a little bit about my story, you know, in terms of where I grew up. At almost every moment and every kind of, you know, transition, I've been the first. I was the first turban Sikh kid to go to my high school in Richmond. I was one of only a few that went to William and Mary. There was one other Sikh at the time on campus, turban wearing Sikh. When I went into the professional world, I went into a consulting firm. I was the only turban Sikh in that entire institution. And then the 9/11 stuff happened, right? And so I had a tremendous amount of pride and ownership of my identity, in particular because I made the deliberate and personal choice to keep my hair and wasn't something that I had, you know, kind of done as reflexively or because my parents had asked me to or made me. And so for me, that was sort of born out of the discrimination and bias and othering that I saw my cousins and my friends and others who were wearing turbans experience, and my father for that matter, that I didn't want them to go through that alone. That I was an average American kid who played basketball and was in the school play and played Abraham Lincoln, and you know, I was as American as the next person, but I came from a community that had this rich and unique culture that was different. And again, I said it's kind of hokey, but like the changing hearts and minds, like I really believe that if I have the opportunity to sit down and have a conversation with someone, you can sort of, you know, eradicate those barriers and start to, you know, let down some of that you know, curiosity in the most favorable terms and hate and bigotry and bias and violence on the other end of the spectrum. That's a sliding scale, and I've been on the wrong side of trying to educate that scale and catch people on the right side of that scale. When I went to law school, it was right after 9/11, it was a year later. I was all fired up and I was ready to get trained as an advocate and come back into that work. And so, you know, first Sikh at my law school, did a clerkship, first turban Sikh that had ever clerked on the Court of Appeals of Virginia. When I looked for a law firm, and that decision was also an inflection point because I didn't know anything. I mean, the Sikh National Bar was born out of the fact that when we were going to law school 25, 30 years ago, there were few, like you know, on one or two hands you could count the number of Sikh lawyers that you knew. So I had no idea what I was doing. There were very few people that had gone to big law firms. My natural kind of inclination was to go right back into the civil rights advocacy, social justice space. But you know, it was getting advice that on the front end, maybe there's value in going to a law firm to have that experience and then move on. And I went to a firm that really embraced diversity at a time when that conversation was just starting. And obviously we're in a weird place now with DEI. But I went there knowing that it was an environment where I was very different and I was the first Sikh, but there was an openness amongst the partnership and amongst the firm where I never once felt like I was compromising or had to compromise my identity. There was never once that someone said, we're not going to take you as an associate to go meet a client because of your identity, or I wouldn't be arguing a motion in court or doing the things. And when I made partner in 2013, I was the first turbaned Sikh partner at an AmLaw 100 firm in US history, right? So it was a glass ceiling that I wanted to break so that those that were coming up behind me could say, I'm gonna push past that discomfort. I'm gonna move past whatever I'm feeling and do the thing. And I felt like I needed to do the thing. And the reason I was able to balance the, being at a big corporate law firm and that social justice origin story was that I brought the Sikh Coalition on as a pro bono client. And as I was able to integrate that pro bono into the work that I was doing, and the work we were doing for the Sikh Coalition was very high profile with religious discrimination in the US military. And so I, not by design, but very much by, happenstance, I was able to educate through osmosis almost that, when the firm is on the front page of the world, the New York Times or the Washington Post because of a case that I'm leading, and the firm is named and recognized and appreciated and celebrated, it forced people to become educated about what it meant to be a Sikh, and to understand the Sikh identity. And hopefully that's something that can be replicated, by others as they're navigating those thorny waters.
Thank you. And please, if you still have a picture of you as Abraham Lincoln, do share it with all of us. I think we'd all love to see you as that. Anirvan, thank you so much for answering a couple of the questions in the Q&A about some of the historical perspectives. The question for you I have is, what can we learn from some of our past solidarity efforts and maybe some of our current ones that resist flattening our identities?
Yeah, I think there's something really powerful in grounding in our own identities to know exactly who we are to the best that we're able. For me, as an Indian American, somebody of Hindu heritage, somebody who grew up middle to upper class, I have access to certain spaces that other folks in our community don't. And there's something really powerful about being able to know what that is, to be able to speak my own language, to be able to just kind of have a certain kind of comfort and not throw my community out because I need for whatever reason. Right now, I'm thinking a lot about all the moments when we have faced attacks, like whether that's mass denaturalization in 1923 or attacks on Muslims, Sikhs, and others after 9/11. And right now, we're living in one of those times again. And for a lot of us, South Asian America can be a home, can be a cultural home, can be a political home, a place where we can really be thinking about solidarity both within and outside. And for me, right now, I'm thinking about a lot of South Asians who are impacted by Trump's policies. I'm thinking about Bhutanese, Nepali-speaking Bhutanese Americans. There are 60 plus folks right now who have been detained, in many cases deported to Nepal or Bhutan, some being pushed back into camps in Nepal. It's a terrible situation, and there are groups like Asian Refugees United doing really critical work. I'm thinking about international students, many of whom are from India and elsewhere, who are being targeted, in some cases getting pushed out of the country, getting thrown out of their programs. As well as kind of general Islamophobia that always kind of kicks up in moments like this. And when we look at a situation like this, whether or not you yourself are a Palestine activist or you yourself are an international student or a Nepali-speaking Bhutanese refugee, there's something about that South Asian American frame that makes it a little bit easier to approach this. There are a million things that we could be doing, but sometimes South Asian American frame, it definitely helps in kind of making sense of that. So I'm thinking, Manju, of what you were saying earlier about being South Asian in Pan-Asian spaces, and sometimes maybe the frame is too big and sometimes it's a little too small and it's complicated. But I really feel like the work that SAAJCO and SAAPRI and others are doing to just make a frame that's around the right size, it's powerful, and I hope we can kind of work through this.
Thank you so much. Manju, what practices help you sustain your work, spiritually, emotionally, practically, especially when the weight of the hate around us may feel overwhelming?
Yeah, thank you. I think a little bit about what our time is right now and what we're going through. Anirvan mentioned the assaults on free speech. Amandeep mentioned what's happening in terms of DEI. And I think what's important for us to remember and right now is that when they attack DEI, it's not simply about having a Diwali celebration at our office or celebrating Lunar New Year or talking about, the impacts of 9/11. When we think of what DEI means and the opposites of those things, right, we have to be aware of the fact the opposite of diversity is segregation, right? That the opposite of equity is a monopoly for white males, something that my mother herself faced only a few decades ago. The opposite of inclusion is exclusion. And my own deed to my house in Los Angeles says that it cannot be owned by a non-white because the original house was built in 1950s when there was redlining. So for me, part of what helps me in this moment is to do the analysis, to understand exactly what's going on, to identify it, to be very clear that this is authoritarian fascism, right? And then when we know and identify what's going on, we can fight it. Right. And I think being in the protest, I was in the May Day rally last week with my several thousand of my closest friends. I was also in the Hands Off March and seeing people who didn't often look like me, but also believed in America and the dream that is America and believed in democracy. And so that's what keeps me sustained alongside, friends, family, colleagues who also believe in these shared values. Because if we're going to fight this, we're going to need all of us standing together. And that's, back to the title of this, From Hate to Hope. I mean, that's what gives me hope and sustains and energizes me.
Thank you. Very well said. I feel like I could spend an hour and a half with each of you all and delve into everything we've talked about today. But I'd love to leave our attendees with just a message of hope a little bit. With all your years of experience, not to age any of you, but so much experience you all carry and the incredible work you're doing, if you could leave this room with one message, especially for those of us who may be younger South Asian leaders, activists, or students, what would it be? Anirvan, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about the idea of selfish solidarity, which is a concept that I learned from Sasha Wijeratne, the amazing Sri Lankan American activist. And just the idea that, like, in 1982, when racists had anti-Japanese sentiment, they killed somebody named Vincent Chin, who was Chinese. I think about 1979 during the Iran hostage crisis, when anti-Iranian sentiment overflowed to so many other non-Iranians. I'm thinking about Amandeep, you're talking about Balbir Singh Sodhi after 2001, a Sikh man who was really caught up in a moment of like anti-Muslim hate, the 1987 Dotbusters attacks, when there were attacks on folks who were kind of perceived as like, wearing a dot, i.e. a bindi. But the person who was first victim of that was Navroz Modi, a Parsi person. And I think about like all those moments when they come for all of us and they can't tell the difference. And it is on us. If they're going to target us together, we're going to stand up together. And it's something that is a moral thing to do. It's a good thing to do, but it's really the only way we're going to keep our families and children safe. So for me, selfish solidarity is absolutely kind of the best way to kind of go at this.
Thank you so much. Anne?
I think about our ecosystem, right? The South Asian American ecosystem. And I think that in order for that ecosystem to be strong, we have to have good infrastructure. And I see the organizations that are represented here as the infrastructure for, to that ecosystem. And I think what I would want to say is perhaps it's, Amandeep mentioned SALT, right? SALT as an organization was the only national organization we had, and it folded, right? And, today as we sit, there are many such organizations who are like trying, looking to survive. And I think my plea to the community, and particularly to the, to the younger, South Asian Americans, is to help strengthen this infrastructure, right? Stay engaged with the organizations that exist, that are doing this good work. We need you, right? We need everybody. And it's important that we reach across, the different identities within our own communities, and political spectrums and whatnot. And we all have common ground. This is a very scary time. I have never felt really scared to be a South Asian American as I feel today. And we all need to band together to be able to survive. And this is not, we've all read about the McCarthy era. This is perhaps even worse.
Thank you.
I hate to leave in a pessimistic note.
But it's real, so I appreciate you sharing. Manju?
Well, you had mentioned there are a lot of young folks potentially on this webinar. And so one thing I would just say is, I want you all to know you're just as smart, you're just as talented, you're probably than many of your colleagues, your fellow students, and others. Have confidence in yourself. You owe it to yourself, you owe it to our communities, to have that confidence and to go out and to share your talents with our communities, with the world. And I'm going to share, and because Amandeep started on this route of using a little salty language, I'm going to end mine with some salty language, which is my life's motto, which I got from an activist named Peggy Saika. She said, "I'm nice, I'm reasonable, but don't fuck with me."
Amen. Amandeep.
Yeah, I feel like we just should stop on that note. It's hard to top that, but I like it. I think that the message to take away is that change doesn't happen quickly, right? It takes a really long time to shift the narrative and put ourselves in a position where we don't have to do this work anymore, right? Like that's always the goal, is that in our lifetime or our children's lifetime, we won't have to have these types of advocacy organizations or these types of conversations. The reality is that we'll be doing this for a very long time, right? And these conversations will continue. And I firmly believe, in the sort of the old adage that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. This is a really difficult time, and I share the sentiments of everyone, on the panel, that I don't think we've experienced anything like this before, certainly in our generation. And so finding your strength, and using that to have a voice, and finding a way to support, your community, support locally. If you're not on the front lines of doing the work, support the organizations that are doing the work. There's, soft diplomacy and simply existing with pride as a South Asian in your workplace or academic institutions, on the street. Hold your head high. And I'll share, I shared the raw emotion that I felt on 9/11, and the fear that was just palpable, right? And I remember, just story after story that our community was experiencing, and I myself experienced. And I see where we are now, and I see this, change that's happened over the last 2 decades, and flipping towards, more understanding. And with the last couple of years of the rise of more bias and hate, I feel that difference. I can see that with people's faces in certain spaces, but I feel confident and protected by the fact that there's now an infrastructure, right? So now there are organizations that are in place that are there to protect me and protect our community. And so we have to, to the point about organizations that have sadly gone away, we can't let that happen in these next, 4 or 5 years or 8 years or however long we're in this troubling period of time. So, find your strength and use that.
Thank you so much. Great last words. Not as good as Manju's, but close. And Anirvan and Manjusha, Amandeep, thank you so much for sharing your words with us, your wisdom with us, and all the incredible work that you all are doing, and excited to continue our conversations and continuing to show up in solidarity with each of you. Thank you to our attendees for joining us for tonight's conversation. We hope this is insightful and engaging webinar in our Engaged Community series. Before we wrap up, just a few quick notes. SAAPRI is conducting a live survey, dropping it in the chat. It's just to better understand the experiences of South Asian immigrants. Our voices are important. We'd really appreciate if you could take a few minutes to complete the survey. And the link is also available on SAAPRI's website. The next is we are going to be compiling notes from each panel and share them as a resource with all attendees. We see there's a number of questions we didn't quite get to, so we will try to answer those before we send out the takeaways as well. And here's a link for that as well. And then our next panel, as part of the Know Your Rights and Unpacking Hate Themes, is on June 12th at 5 p.m. Central, Intersecting Identities, Confronting Hate Against Queer South Asians. Let me drop that too. And thank you again for being here and for being part of these really important conversations to just uplift the voices, the work of all those doing amazing things in our community, and to highlight the challenges that we're facing and to build resilience and hope as we move forward. Thank you all so much to our guests. Thank you for those of you attending, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you for keeping